Back in 1984, the city of Los Angeles was the host city for the Olympic Games. I remember watching on television the opening ceremonies for those games. And if you think about the Coliseum where the opening ceremony was held, you know that down at the end of the Coliseum, the east end, I believe, there are a lot of little alcoves there. And I don't know why it was designed that way, but it was. And in the opening ceremony, they had in each of those alcoves, they had a piano. And then the orchestra that was playing started playing George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. And then all of those pianos together chimed in and played the Rhapsody in Blue. That just really took me. I love music, and I love that song. I've never heard so many, I guess about 20 different pianos, and excellent pianists at the keyboard of each, and they played the Rhapsody in Blue. It was beautiful harmony. They were all in tune. They all played according to the direction of the conductor, and it was really a sight to behold. Later, as I thought about that, I thought about the fact that harmonious living is symbolized by that beautiful, wonderful rendition of the Rhapsody in Blue. And yet we're living at a time when there's so much disharmony in the world. There are so many homes that are breaking up. And I want to use the breakup of homes for just a moment to help us to see the tragedy of non-harmonious living. Now, I don't know whether there's a word non-harmonious or not, but there is now. And if you go home and look in your dictionary, I hope you'll find it. But the non-harmonious, the disrupting character of American home life is really just one of the greatest tragedies, I think, of the 21st century and of the latter part of the 20th century. Statistics have been gathered together about marriage and divorce and remarriage and the breakup of the American home. 40 to 50% are numbers that have been given many, many times about the number of marriages that end in divorce. Now, that's been controverted by some. The statistics are very hard, very difficult to come by. I read a portion of a report from the State University of Utah, and they affirmed that although this cannot be an exact number, that is very close to 40 to 50% of the marriages currently in our country sometime or another will end in divorce. All agree that compared with the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, many years ago, that there were nowhere near that many divorces proportionally. So we have to ask ourselves, what happened? Well, like I say, the statistics are hard to come by. People live together without being married many times. A great violation of what the Bible says about these things. Sometimes it's because of very early marriages. Sometimes it's because of differences in religion. Sometimes it's because of the differences in upbringing, their own homes and so forth. There are all kinds of things that skew the statistics that we're talking about. Princeton University published a survey of a number of studies that had been done. And here's a quotation from that survey. Each year since the late 1970s, more than 1 million couples become divorced. Currently, most people who are divorced, or who divorce, do so in the early marriage, and half of the divorces occur in the 7th year of marriage. One of the most important effects of the rise in the divorces especially in the early years of a marriage, has been the increase in the proportion of divorces that occur among women with young children. We don't need to comment on that, and yet I'm going to. Children so much of the time are forgotten about to a great extent in reference to divorce. By forgotten about, I mean this. Well, we'll go ahead and divorce, but we'll see this about the children. Why not see about the children, not about the divorce? See how the marriage can be repaired. See how the marriage can work and preserve the sanctity of the home. Well, there are all kinds of things that come up about children. When children are reared in homes without fathers, for example, there are consistent details that tell us about how tragic the rearing of those children is. And so much of the time, those children are not raised with any kind of a father figure and a mother who works, and consequently children who are not cared for as children need to be cared for. Children need to see a mother and father who love each other. They need to see in their home two parents, not only who love each other, but who love their child. They need to learn Christian virtues. They need to learn Christian values by seeing those things exemplified in their parents. And yet so much of the time there's infidelity among the parents. So much of the time there is neglect among the parents. And so the disintegration of the homes that we value so highly as Christian people, this descent in the harmony of life becomes a very, very important thing. The sanctity of marriage has been set aside to a great extent. On the TV just the other night, I heard a statement concerning the number of people now who recognize anything religious about their marriage. And only about 40% of the people who marry have any reference to the religious aspect or what the Bible says or anything like that about marriage and divorce and remarriage. And so children, unfortunately, are brought up in that kind of an atmosphere. In addition to that, I noticed as I was preparing this lesson, I noticed that on the internet, of all things, there was an advertisement, get your divorce online. I didn't know you could do that. And maybe you can. But divorces online, it was advertised for $129. I have no idea of what that's talking about, but I do see that the advertising of the ease of divorce, just irreconcilable differences and things like this, has encouraged the home to be broken down. Well, what are some effects of that? Children are raised without two parents. Much of the crime, much of the riots, the fires that are set because of riots and things like that, come out of the instability, the non-harmonious character of America's homes. In our text, Paul lists about 10 things, kind of depending on how you look at them, but there are about 10 things that he lists talking about how to bring harmony into your life. Now, let's forget about the homes for a moment. Let's think in terms not just of the home, but in all aspects of my life. Some people live a very non-harmonious life in reference to their work, in reference to where they live, in reference to the neighborhood, the community, and so forth. And so, how do we get along with this? How do we bring harmony out of disharmony? How do we bring order out of disturbance like this? And Paul gives us some wonderful ideas here that I want to just list them. Number one, he says, bless those who persecute you. And we will talk about these individually in a moment. Bless those who persecute you. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Do not be conceited. Do not take vengeance on those who have injured you. Do not return evil for evil. Do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it be possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give them something to drink. So much of that is so contrary to what we learn in our culture, isn't it? I've placed these things in three categories, just as a matter of organization and putting them so we can present them. The first is my attitude and harmonious living. Attitude plays an important role. The second is our adversaries and harmonious living. And the third is our personal behavior and harmonious living. Let's look at attitudes first. Attitude determines so much of what I do. Attitude determines so much of how I treat other people. Attitude determines so much about how I feel about others, my judgment of other people. How I think of myself has to do with an attitude that I have. How I misjudge other people has to do with an attitude. Listen to what Jesus says. Do not judge, or you will be judged. In the same way that you judge others, you're going to be judged. And with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you. I remember as I was growing up, that was always applied to the final judgment. No, that's not what Jesus is talking about at all. He's talking about how I learn to treat people, people are going to learn to treat me. If I am belligerent toward people, people are going to be belligerent toward me. If I am judgmental toward people, people are going to be judgmental toward me. That's the idea. Jesus is just saying, you're going to receive, you're going to reap what you sow. And that's just a fundamental thing of life, isn't it? That's just the way life works. Many people misuse this and misapply it, though, to just apply to all kinds of things. And when I'm doing something, when I'm doing something and somebody else says, Jack, you ought not to do that. The first thing, judge not, Don't judge me. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus isn't talking about the idea that we ought not to condemn evil. Instead, he's saying, look at evidence. Treat people with compassion. Evaluate people with sympathy, not with a judgmental, determined attitude. Well, Paul goes on and talks about being proud. He says, don't be proud. Don't be conceited. Well, like a fellow says, anybody who is as good as I am has a right to be conceited. But I didn't say that about myself. I said, I've heard people say that. And then other people say, I'm very humble, I'm very proud of my humility. A fellow by the name of C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters. You've heard me mention this book. It's a supposed book. It is a supposed setting, rather, in this book where Screwtape is the devil, and he's writing letters to what he calls his junior tempter. And the junior tempter apparently had said something about this. And so Screwtape writes and he says, I see from your letter you say you're patient, and that's who he's working on. I see where you say your patient had become very humble and you can't do anything with him. And then he said, have you reminded him of his humility? Well, Humility turns to pride when we begin thinking of just how humble we really are. And so the idea is, Paul says, don't be proud. Don't be arrogant. Don't be conceited. Instead, be a person of humility. Now, the background of that is very important and very interesting, because in the Roman Empire, in the situation in which Paul wrote, in which this was stated, humility was a sign of, well, you're a wimp. If you're humble, you're a wimp. If you're humble, you're weak. If you're humble, you don't stand for anything. That isn't what humility is. I think it's very hard to define, but this is kind of a working definition that I feel like works for me anyway. I hope it works for us. Humility is understanding, knowing, and accepting my weaknesses, but is balanced by understanding and knowing and accepting my strengths. And these things, when kept in balance, form the genuine humble person. Jesus was a humble person, but Jesus stood very strongly for what was right, and he condemned what was wrong very strongly. He did not do it in arrogant terms or anything like that. He was a person of great humility. Paul said, don't do anything out of selfish ambition or out of vain conceit, but in humility consider other people better than yourselves. And James said, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. That's an attitude that we need to look at. And then another thing that Paul says in reference to these things, he says, we ought to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. A number of years ago, my brother-in-law in Nashville, Tennessee, died after surgery on his heart. My sister could not stand the idea of going to the funeral home and seeing all the people who were coming to the wake. She finally decided to come. And the basic reason was that while Charles was living, people would rejoice with those who rejoiced. And so some of them said, Sue, these same people now want to come and weep with you while you weep. So, you see, the whole idea of compassion, the idea of sympathy, sometime when someone is having a difficult time, maybe there's a loss in a family, maybe there's a loss of a job, maybe there's something very disappointing that has taken place, sometimes just a word from another person, I'm praying for you. I know you're having a difficult time. I know this is a great loss to you. I just want you to know you're in my prayers. Sometimes just a personal word like that just builds a person up and makes that person so much more secure in his or her difficulty, whatever it might be. Rejoice with those who rejoice. You're the person who has succeeded in something. Oh, I've been trying to do that for a long time, and I have failed, and now here's someone who did it one time and he succeeded. And so I'm jealous of him. Kind of hard to rejoice with that fellow, you know, because he has accomplished what I've been trying to do and haven't been able to. And so there's this uneasy feeling that I have in myself because I can't rejoice with him when he rejoices. Adam Clark wrote something one time that I thought was very interesting. Adam Clark was a very famous commentator who lived back in the early 1800s. And here's what he said. He said, jealousy is that uneasy feeling that we experience when we see the excellence of others. I thought that was about the best statement of what jealousy really is of anything that I had ever read. My attitude toward other people helps to keep me away from the jealousy that we're talking about. Then we can not only rejoice with those who rejoice, we can also weep with those who weep. Well, the next thing is, what about my treatment of my adversaries? Oh, there's a terrible statement in the Bible. It was said by Jesus. It's just an awful statement. Love your enemies. We don't like that, do we? We like to hate our enemies. We want to kill our enemies. We want to destroy our enemies. And when something bad happens to our enemies, oh, we're so glad. No. Jesus says, love your enemies. Well, that isn't an easy thing to do, though, folks. Our adversary, by the way, there's nothing wrong with having enemies. Jesus recognized that we had enemies. Jesus had his own enemies. It isn't wrong to have enemies, but the question is, how do I treat these enemies? Love your enemies. Well, our culture says, I don't love them, I get even with them. I don't love them, I take vengeance on them. And so the present day riots that we've had so many of right here lately, these present day riots and the burning of buildings, whether they belong to people that we are adverse to or not, just going out and burning things, tearing things down, wrecking cars, setting them on fire, and so forth and so forth and so forth. All of these things, you see, come about because we don't know how to treat our adversaries. And so Paul says, Jesus says, love your enemies. And so Paul says, on the contrary to things that are generally thought of, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is athirst, give him to drink. Well, that's difficult. I don't know of any enemies that I have, but perhaps I have some. But how would I be willing to treat that enemy if indeed that person was my enemy? Would I rejoice in his failure, or would I go and try to help him to get out of his failure? So if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is athirst, give him to drink. And then Paul says this, in doing so, you will heap coals of fire upon his head. Well, I remember a story. I don't know whether this really happened or not. It was told for a real story. There was a little girl, and one of her friends had done something terrible to her. And she came home crying to her mother. And after she finished crying, she went to the pantry and got some cookies. And her mother says, what are you going to do with the cookies? I'm going to take them over to my friend, the one that beat me up, the one that hurt me. I said, why are you going to do that? And she said, well, because the Bible says that if you do good to those who do evil to you, God will heap coals of fire on their head, and maybe God will do that for her. Well, that was just a way of getting vengeance, wasn't it? And so he says, don't avenge yourselves, beloved. But then it goes a little bit further. He says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and curse not. Now, to the people to whom Paul originally wrote this, that was a very meaningful thing because those people in Rome were being persecuted. Sometime later, they were put up on the grounds of the circus and tied to a stake, poured oil on them, and set them on fire to illuminate the circus that Nero was having. And so there are all kinds of things like this. And so Paul says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and curse not. Jesus exemplified this. What was it that Jesus said on the cross? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Folks, that takes fortitude. That takes conviction. That takes the depth of love for other people that unfortunately we don't experience many times. Well, then there's the final thing about my personal behavior. That was a part of it, Jesus on the cross. But let me learn that there are some circumstances over which I have no control. And so Paul recognizes that, and he says, as much as is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. I think that one of the things that Paul is saying here is, if conflict arises, let it not be because of you, let it be because of someone else. Instead, you learn to be the one who will quell the riot. You be the one who will quell the controversy. You be the one who will pour oil on the waters. I remember a friend of mine. He was a preacher. He's dead now. As a matter of fact, I grew up with this fellow. And he was talking about a congregation where the elders of the congregation were going to visit people who were not attending, who were just falling by the wayside. And they were talking about what they were going to do. And they were going to show them this and this and this and condemn, and so forth. And one of them said, wait a minute. Maybe we ought to think about our own responsibility about this. And so he suggested maybe what we ought to do is to go to these people and apologize to them because we haven't done our duty toward them. They thought about that. And I don't mean this as a mechanical thing, but I mean it as a real practical application. This fellow was named Jack Exum, and some of you probably have read some of his books. He said, Jack, when the elders went into people, they thought they were going to receive condemnation. And when they apologized for their own lack of leadership, their own lack of accomplishing what they need to accomplish, that the people felt like that they were there to help, not to condemn. And so I need to learn that insofar as I am concerned, I need to learn to live peaceably with other people, even in the face of controversy. Paul says in the second verse, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And so the world is not my standard. The world is not supposed to be how I direct my life. Instead, Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, the renewal of your attitudes. This practice of harmonious life, then, can come to life in our own lives when we learn that being in harmony with God equips us to be at harmony with our fellow men. Can I challenge you? Sit down and read the 12th chapter of Romans. The whole thing. It's only about 20 verses long. Sit down and read the 12th chapter of Romans every day this week and say to yourself, I am going to try every day this week. I'm going to try to live in harmony with all of the people that I meet. I will not be the source of controversy. I will be the source of solution. I will not be the source of disturbance. I will be the one who stills the troubled waters.